Hello and welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me yet, I'm Mandy Lee. I'm the founder of Careers in Arbitration. Thank you for joining us to celebrate our 4th birthday. Thanks to all of you, we've come a long way since 2019. We've shared hundreds of job vacancies, events, lectures, and mentorship opportunities, even a few book lists. We've collaborated with fantastic organizations and colleagues around the world. We've held 3 International Women's Day campaigns, and thanks to our friends at Digital Coffee Break in Arbitration and Tales of the Tribunal, we've even raised some money for charity through Arbitration Idol. So let me take this moment to say a big thank you to all of you for showing up today, to all 57,000 people who follow this platform, and to everyone who tags vacancies, reaches out to me about events, and more. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Now, we don't have a birthday every day, and so we wanted to make this one special. I was going to take the opportunity to perform a magic trick on the air, but I decided you might prefer to hear from Gary Bourne instead. Now, I don't think I need to introduce Gary, other than to say, in addition to being arbitration counsel and arbitrator of many years standing, he's recently published his first novel, which is called The File. So here we go. I have a copy. One lucky person who signed up for today's event will be receiving their very own copy. And if we're very nice to him, he may even read us a bit today. We shall see. So I'm going to begin by asking him a few questions, because after all, this is Careers in Arbitration in conversation with Gary Bourne, and then I'll turn the floor over to you. So without further ado, let's get started. Hello, Gary. Thank you for joining us for today's birthday celebration.
No, thank you so much, and happy birthday. Thanks so much to both you and Careers in Arbitration for having me here, and equally important thanks to everyone for joining.
So let's start at the beginning. How did your career in arbitration begin? Did you find arbitration, or did it find you?
That's a great question, Mandy. And I think, like most great relationships, we found each other. Like many people a few years ago, I never studied international arbitration in law school. Best as I can recall, there wasn't an international arbitration course. I don't think there was ever even any reference in my public international law courses to international arbitration. Arbitration wasn't really a thing. So it was a little hard for me, at least at the outset, to go looking for it. And in that sense, it started by finding me. I was an associate in the Washington office of WilmerHale Pickering, the time Washington law firm with a small London outpost. The name partner in the law firm, Lloyd Cutler, received a phone call from, of all people, Greenpeace, which reported that no doubt the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, had blown up their one ship, their flagship, the Rainbow Warrior, in Auckland Harbor in New Zealand. And since very few people in the world were stupid enough to have done that, it must have been the CIA, and therefore they needed a good Washington lawyer. My boss, Lloyd Cutler, had been counsel to various US presidents and the like. He and I immediately came up with the idea that the right way to resolve this dispute, instead of trying to sue France in the courts of New Zealand or England or elsewhere, was to persuade them to arbitrate this dispute. And for a variety of reasons, both sides mutually decided that that was in fact a good idea. And that ended up being my first international arbitration, arbitration about what the French termed the incident in Auckland Harbor on, I forget what the night was, I think June 12th or so, and the financial consequences of that. The arbitration proceeded, despite its peculiar origins, smoothly. And in that sense, arbitration found me. After that, though, I assiduously tried to hunt arbitration down because the first arbitration was so much fun. I wanted more.
Thank you very much. You wear many hats: counsel, arbitrator, academic, author, and now spy novelist. Frankly, we should probably start referring to you as a hat stand. Do you have a favorite?
So I think anybody needs a good wardrobe, and naturally that means you have to have lots of hats. And just like children and cats, you shouldn't, I don't think, ever really have a favorite. I like them all. If I had to choose one, I honestly don't know which one I would choose. If I were thinking about choosing amongst various lawyerly pursuits, I suspect I would default to more or less where I started, which was counsel in arbitration. And still, in terms of excitement, adrenaline, requirement for creativity and the like, I think has to be the default choice. But I would be loath to actually have to choose. I'd prefer to be a hat stand.
Very good. One of the most popular questions we've received in advance of this session basically asks, how do you manage to fit everything in and still maintain some sort of balance in your life, so you've got time to see the children and the cats?
Well, lots of times questions start from a faulty premise, and that sort of assumes the degree of balance on my side. And I think many of my colleagues and perhaps tribunals that I appear before might push back on that premise. I think the only way you really keep balance when you have a lot of things going is a little bit like when you're riding a bicycle. You have to get up a certain amount of speed and momentum, otherwise you just fall over. And so I think in terms of balance, the truth of the matter is when as I think everybody who's on this webinar must feel, when you love what you do, then having more of it rather than less of it, at least in a strange way, provides its own balance. At least that's the case for me.
Very good. I'm glad to hear you're not falling over like a bicycle. That's very encouraging.
Give me a chance. It may soon happen.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You heard it here, folks. What lessons have you learned from your career to date?
So I'm not sure, again, that I accept the premise of that. Have I really learned all that much in these years? Some opposing parties might question that premise as well. I think I've learned sort of oddly contradictory things, and I'm not sure that really will help many of the participants, the listeners. One thing that I have learned is trust your own instincts. First impressions are, everyone always says they're important. We've all read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and the importance of immediate reactions. But I do think it's very important both for younger and also more senior practitioners, but arbitrators as well. Trust your own instincts. If something tells you that it's not right, or that there may be a solution in this other direction, trust it and sort of push on that. Follow your instincts. I promised you, though, contradictory advice. It's a little bit like my treatise, I suppose. And the other advice is never assume that what you've had suggested to you, or some proposition that's presented to you, is wrong, even if your first instinct is it's not right. And even though I told you to trust that instinct, also pursue the contrary hypotheses. I don't know how many times I've thought, oh, we should really cut this argument. We've got 3 other great arguments. We don't need this argument. Standard advocacy is keep it short, keep it concise, stay with your best points, don't overload the tribunal with extraneous or weaker points. And I've been minded, therefore, to drop a particular argument, a particular line of analysis, and persuaded by an assiduous colleague to keep it in. I've then often been surprised that, in fact, it not only was worth keeping in, but it's the one that actually persuaded the tribunal. And so what I think I've learned, the 2 most important things that I've learned, and I promised that this would be contradictory, is follow your own instincts, trust your own instincts, but also test them and give scope to other people's ideas as well.
Thank you. Now, we have a lot of aspiring arbitration practitioners on the line today who are eager to hear your thoughts on how they can stand out and ultimately succeed and excel in arbitration. So, what does your firm look for when hiring an associate?
This is a very, unfortunately, this is a boring answer. Like a lot of big law participants, a lot of the denizens of the big law world, we look to grades and similar things to that. I think grades, just plain good performance, whether at university and law school and other types of courses, are hugely important. I know that many like to specialize, to focus these days. It's not just that there's an international arbitration course, obviously, in contrast to some earlier eras, there are dozens, and I know there's an inclination on the part of many, at least on the part of some, to take all those courses, or at least a fair number of them, to demonstrate a commitment to international arbitration or to some other subject matter. I do think, though, that getting a very solid grounding across the board in all aspects of law is hugely important, and for law firms in terms of hiring, doing well in those courses. I know that's not terribly exciting news, and for some it may be disappointing if the transcript hasn't turned out quite as well as one hopes. But certainly what my firm does, and I know what for a number of other firms do, is looks very hard at grades. Obviously, other things are important. Recommendations, performance in interviews, and the like are hugely important. But the sort of very old school, just have a good transcript with good grades on it is hugely important still.
Thank you. So for everybody listening who's still in law school, still studying, you want to be focusing on getting the best possible grades if you want to succeed in arbitration. Now, we also have plenty of aspiring arbitrators in the audience today. When did you start sitting as an arbitrator, and what advice do you have for those who wish to follow in your footsteps?
So as with other things in life, getting your first appointment, doing anything for the first time is often the most difficult. How is it that you get that first appointment? My first appointment came through sheer chance, pure luck. I was an associate. I'm not sure quite why. A rather senior partner at a distinguished New York law firm decided to select me as a co-arb. But he did, and that in fact was my first appointment. It was a little frightening in some sense, because there weren't really how-tos back at that point. There weren't how-tos in the form of the IBA guidelines on conflicts of interest with respect to disclosure. There weren't CIR guidelines on how one behaves as an arbitrator. There weren't conferences or programs like this to provide hints along the way. So you learn from your mistakes quite literally, at least I did. Perhaps others didn't need to make those mistakes. I think for today, there are a couple routes, needless to say, for that first appointment, but also the second and third, which are also difficult. The first appointment can come from an institution, and often institutions, particularly in the smaller value cases or expedited proceedings, may look to younger lawyers. I know some institutions, Singapore International Arbitration Center, for example, have policies whereby for smaller cases they will try to appoint younger practitioners, and so being known to the institution is certainly one way to look for that first appointment. I think if one's pragmatic about it, though, the more likely way is through appointment as a co-arb. Perhaps also in smaller cases, but cases that instead of a sole arbitrator have a 3-person tribunal. I say it's more pragmatic because obviously in those cases, there are 2 possibilities for appointment plus the reserved possibility, so to speak, for the presiding arbitrator. But I think being known to colleagues, the types of people who are likely to be making appointments, having them to have confidence in you, but also be aware that you're interested in appointments, I think is a sensible way forward. One has to obviously strike a fine line, as in any type of so-called business development, between not being too eager, but nonetheless signaling interest. I suspect many of the participants, many of those listening, have heard these kinds of suggestions previously, but I do think staying in touch with those at peer law firms, other law firms, and the practitioners in the international arbitration groups there who are likely to either be making appointments or recommending names for appointments is a sensible way forward.
Thank you. What do you think you'd be doing if you were not in arbitration?
So if I weren't in arbitration, I mean, I wish I could say something exciting, like I'd be, I don't know, a deep sea scuba diver hunting for shipwrecks or something like that. That would match more my self-image. But I suspect if I weren't doing international arbitration, I'd be doing international litigation. In a sense, that's where I started out before arbitration found me. It's where my first book, it's the field my first book was in, and therefore, for better or for worse, I think I would probably be doing another type of international dispute resolution.
I probably should have asked you a different question. Then I should have asked you what you'd be doing if you weren't a lawyer.
If I weren't a lawyer, I think I'd be, I sort of like this spy novel thing. I might be spending a little bit more time writing spy novels, but more on that in a bit, perhaps.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in that vein, many congratulations on the publication of your first novel, The File. And I have the book, as you've all seen here. Da-da-da. Here we go. Would you like to tell us a bit about it? I think you would.
Oh no.
What a terrible question.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about it. And I'm not sure quite what the best way to talk about it is. I guess just a sort of elevator pitch for what it's about. It's 350 or so pages long. It's doesn't have pretensions to being Ulysses or some other profound bit of literature. It's meant to be good, exciting fun. It's about a young woman, Sarah West, who's on an expedition in Central Africa, trying to discover new types of flowers and plants. She chances, of all things, upon the wreckage of a Nazi bomber crashed at the end of World War II. On the bomber, she discovers a file. It's the title, The File. And in that file cabinet, she finds documents that do 2 things. One, they tell whoever has those documents how you can access billions of dollars in secret numbered Swiss bank accounts that were established by the Nazis at the end of World War II, at least the storyline goes. And secondly, you can find the names of all the most important Nazi spies and sympathizers outside Germany, and in particular in the United States, elsewhere in Europe, at the end of World War II. Immediately after she discovers those documents, 2 men, evil men, discover that she has found those things. One, a former KGB agent who has himself been looking for these documents, and in particular, the bank account information for the better part of a decade. He wants the money. And the other, the deputy director of the CIA, whose dad and granddad are high on the list of the Nazis' top spies outside of Germany, notwithstanding their distinguished U.S. political dynasty, which their grandson has inherited. He too wants those documents to hide the fact that his family has very disreputable origins. Both men send teams of mercenaries to track down Sarah and her file, and lengthy chase scene through the jungle in Uganda or the Congo ensues. One would have thought that Sarah would be easy prey, a young woman alone in the jungle for these two competing teams of mercenaries. But that fails to reckon with the fact that Sarah actually grew up in the jungles, having done multiple expeditions like this with her parents in the past, and she proves to be difficult prey. At some point, the Russians corner her. The Americans swoop in, and a firefight ensues. She falls in love with a rogue CIA agent who, after he avoids being killed by her, because love doesn't happen at first sight in this novel, decides to help her escape, and they hijack a plane, fly north towards Switzerland. And I don't want to spoil the rest of the story, but the firefights, the chases, the betrayals continue until a hopefully climatic finale in Zurich, in the headquarters of a prestigious private bank.
I think you should have come with a spoiler warning for that particular answer, but hopefully that will have given everybody in the audience a bit of an insight into the sort of things they can be expecting if they read a copy. Now, your novel takes readers on a journey across the globe. Were Sarah West's adventures inspired by any of your adventures in international arbitration or otherwise?
So I think every novel probably has pieces of the author's past in it, and mine certainly does. Most of the locations, many of the people had some sort of inspiration from real life. I don't think too much came out of the international arbitration aspects of my life. I think I'm proud of the fact that there isn't a single lawyer and certainly no legal proceeding in the entire book. This is not John Grisham or Scott Thoreau legal thriller. It's not about, it doesn't have anything to do with law, much less with international arbitration. Nonetheless, there are individuals and there's certainly places that are taken from bits of my past. At one point, just after law school, I spent a couple of weeks hiking in exactly the place where the novel starts, the Ruwenzori Mountains on the border between Uganda and Congo.
Thank you. I think somebody will probably be reading this book and using it as inspiration for a sort of partial world tour. I always have that feeling when I read Around the World in 80 Days. So hopefully somebody will be similarly inspired.
Yeah, this has some good scenes in Italy as well, if one likes that part of the world.
Always a good country to visit, I think, Italy. Nice food, nice people. Now, there are no doubt a few differences between writing a spy novel and writing, for example, an award or a brief. Did you find it challenging to adopt a different style?
So you're absolutely right that the styles of, on the one hand, a novel, on the other hand, basically anything you do in international arbitration, but also I think law generally, are enormously different. One might think, gosh, he spends his whole life writing, he ought not to find it so difficult to just write something different, write a novel instead of writing a memorial. But they are worlds and worlds apart, and I did find it very challenging to shift from one to the other. When you sit with a blank piece of paper in front of you, and even if you know precisely what's supposed to happen in that chapter, who the characters are, where it's set, what basically is going to occur, there are an infinite combination of ways that thing can occur, the way that those people can behave, what they can say to one another. And in some sense, there are very few rules as to how that all transpires. There are very few rules that tell you how to write that chapter. And when you think about it, that's almost the polar opposite from what we do mostly in international arbitration. Mostly in international arbitration, we have a set of institutional arbitration rules that tell us what's got to go in the request for arbitration. We've got in-house knowledge and learning and templates, models as to how we write that thing, the request for arbitration. We are enormously constrained by what the law is and by what the facts are, what the evidence shows. You can't just, the way you can in the novel, go off and make stuff up. Some people do. Some of my counterparties, their counsel do, but we're not meant to do that. And in contrast, when you're writing a novel, that's basically all you're doing. And so adjusting from one very regulated, constrained environment to a totally different environment is very challenging. Obviously, when you're writing a novel, you need also to be true to the storyline, and perhaps more importantly, true to the characters as you develop the characters along the way. You need to continue that development, to make them true, to make them real. And sometimes they push back. Sometimes after you've created a character, after I created Sarah, or perhaps after I found her, she would push back when my initial inclination was to write a chapter in a particular way. I could almost hear her say, no, that's not the way this is going to end.
You're very well known as a prolific author of arbitration books and international litigation books and articles and blog posts and so on and so forth. Do you have any top tips for arbitration practitioners who are keen to improve and develop their arbitration drafting alongside their alternative pursuits in whether they're drafting spy novels or they're drafting Instagram posts or whatever they might be doing?
So first of all, I do think it's very important, perhaps particularly in international arbitration, to do these things, to write, in a sense, extrajudicially or extracurricularly. I think it makes sense, in part just because it raises one's profile, and with business development being as important as it is in today's world, the world of international arbitration and elsewhere, I think that's quite important. So writing things other than just your request for arbitration, your memorial, whatnot, I do think is very important. I think understanding the genre that you're going to write in is also hugely important. Read what other people have done. Read what other people have done, and that has been well received. Whether it's because it makes some journals list of the most frequently read articles, or because you hear colleagues referring to it or talking about it, being sort of in the voice of whatever it is you're doing, a blog post, a law review article, some sort of shorter contribution, I think is hugely important. I think also, and this begins to be a little bit more personal in a sense, I think also aspiring to be as sort of clear and transparent as you possibly can be is important. I think sometimes we're prone as advocates to get carried away with our own advocacy, to not see the other side of an argument or a particular issue. And I think particularly for extrajudicial things, but also frankly for submissions in arbitrations, not falling into that trap, not being intoxicated by one's own rhetoric or thinking that a particular way to look at things is the only way to do so is important. Laying out as clearly as possible what the the competing arguments, competing lines of analysis are, I think is very important. Readers for the most part are smart and objective, and you're not going to persuade them of something unless you've recognized and dealt with the other things that might be in their minds.
Thank you. So now we've heard a little bit about the file. Is there anything you'd like to read to the audience today from it? Or is that might be too big an ask?
Yeah, you threatened you would do this. So I struggled with what I might read out of it. And so I defaulted to just the beginning. It may put some people off, but on the other hand, maybe it won't. So what I'll do is I'll read a dozen paragraphs or so of this. It'll take a couple minutes, but hopefully folks will like it. Chapter 1, Sarah West. She looked across the lake as the sun began to set. Her eyes were gray like the waves washing against the shore. She stood at the window of the hotel room. The window panes were dirty, cracked in a few places, and never repaired. Thick, rusted bars were anchored into wooden beams at the top and bottom of the window frame. She looked between the bars up and down the dusty street for signs of the men who were hunting her. An old woman returning home from the market, wrapped in a length of faded cloth, balanced a basket on her head as she picked her way past the potholes, but otherwise the road was empty. She opened the window and reached through the bars to close the shutters. They were weathered with slats missing in a handful of places and creaked as she pulled them shut. She closed the window and drew the curtain, shutting out the evening light. She turned away from the window and walked across the room. The concrete floor was rough and she could feel the grit beneath her feet. The room was nearly empty, the whitewashed walls and ceiling barely visible in the half light. A single cot with threadbare sheets stood against the wall. Mosquito netting hung from the ceiling above the bed, mended in a dozen places and streaked where guests had killed the insects that came in from the lake. She had found the hotel earlier that day. It was all she needed. It took cash, no questions asked, and had a room with a sink and a mirror. The sink was chipped and missing one of the faucets. The mirror was older with faded glass. A single bulb was mounted over the mirror and cast feeble yellow light into the darkness of the room. She turned on the one faucet that still worked and washed her hands using what was left of the bar of coarse soap to scrub away the mud from weeks in the jungle. When she finished, she dried her hands and opened the backpack that lay on the cot next to the sink. She took out the thick stack of papers that had almost cost her life and laid it aside. She searched inside the pack and found the candle and matches. She lit the candle and let wax drip onto the bedside table before fixing the candlestick upright. Deeper in her pack, she found the medical kit, bright red with yellow Cyrillic lettering, and took out the iodine, bandages, and package with the sterilized needle, then arranged them on the table. She looked into the mirror above the sink. She had thick blonde hair, tangled and dirty from the jungle, pulled back from high cheekbones, still lightly streaked with mud. Her eyes were almond-shaped, half blue, half gray, wide-set and large. Their gaze was cold and wary, as if they were watching something in the distance. She looked away from the mirror, barely recognizing the reflection. She wore jeans torn in a half dozen places and caked with dirt rubbed deep into the creases. Her t-shirt was once white, but now gray and brown, mottled with white where her sweat had dried. On her left side, the cloth was dark brown and stiff. She took a breath and then lifted the t-shirt up gently over her left breast. The gash was 20 centimeters long, starting at the end of her collarbone and running diagonally down to the place where the swell of her breast began. It had been made by a machete, wielded by one of the men who was hunting her in the jungle. The man had barely missed her throat as she wheeled cat-like away from his blade, gleaming silver in the moonlight, pivoting so that he'd almost missed her entirely. But he hadn't, and instead the tip of his blade had caught her, tracing a glistening slash across her left breast. She looked back into the mirror, eyes locked in the faded glass, and let her fear rise. She let it wash over her the way she had practiced, and then steadied herself, leaning against the sink. She put aside the fear and the sadness that had stalked her through the jungle for the last 3 weeks. She picked up the iodine and drenched the wound above her breast before swabbing it clean, trying to ignore the surge of pain that followed. There were no more painkillers. She'd taken the last of the tablets the day before. She opened the package that contained the needle, already threaded with a length of surgical thread. She held the tip in the candle's flame, then wiped it clean. She leaned forward further, hips pressed tightly against the sink, and held the top of the wound closed, then drew another breath. She poised the needle against her skin on one side of the wound before pushing it in, forcing the metal through her skin, watching the droplets of blood well up out of the puncture. Then she drew the needle slowly through that side of the wound, followed by the surgical thread, before pushing the point of the needle into the other side of the gash and forcing it back into her flesh. She could feel the thread slide through her skin as she pulled it tight, the knot tugging against the wound. She stopped and leaned against the sink, bracing herself against the pain. Then she rested the tip of the needle against the side of the wound again, less than half a centimeter from the first stitch, and did it once more. She pulled the thread through her skin to finish the second stitch, feeling the pain bore its way through her breast. She stopped again for a moment to wipe the sweat from her face and the blood from her fingers, and forced herself to take up the needle and sew another stitch into her skin, and then another and another. So a bit more than I promised or threatened, but that's what it's like.
Thank you very much. I think you got into the flow of it there, you see. Is this the first arbitration audience to hear you do a live reading?
Well, hearings sometimes have readings from transcripts and the like, so I suspect
almost as exciting. Well, we are getting a lot of questions coming in for you. So one last question before we turn the floor over to our audience. And this is a question from my mom, who gets a shout out as a result. She's read the book and she's asked me, she said, can you ask Gary, will there be a sequel?
So the book ends in sequel territory, and I don't want, spoiler alert, I don't want to spoil the ending in any sense, but there certainly could be a sequel. I am working on a second novel, but it is not a sequel. It's a different set of characters. It's a different time. It's a different place. It's called The Priest, and stay tuned for that. There may be a sequel to the file, but Mom, and I appreciate very much her loyalty and her attention, her interest. We'll have to wait until The Priest is done.
Well, I'll let her know, and we'll see how kindly she's feeling towards you once I tell her. Now, we're getting lots of questions in the Q&A. If you have a question for Gary, you can input your question into the Q&A box. Please remember, if you've seen Tag Time, you will know that we have advice about questions. A question is a question if it ends with a question mark. Do not ask Gary a statement. That is not a question. And if we could try and keep questions to less than, a paragraph, that would be great. Because otherwise, by the time I've read them out, Gary might have lost interest in the length of the question. It could be very, very long, and I could read it in a very boring way. So if we can be succinct, I'd be very grateful. All right, so let's see what we've got. So Praveen Sandhu asks, can you share some insights from the most challenging arbitration that you've had as arbitrator?
So as arbitrator, that's interesting. I was ready to share things about challenging cases I've had as counsel. It's interesting because being an arbitrator is obviously very different than being counsel. When you're counsel, you represent obviously a particular party, and in a sense, although you have to be true to the evidence and the law, you're predisposed in a particular way, and predisposed pretty distinctly and therefore there are challenges when the evidence or the law doesn't quite match up to your predisposition. You're challenged to nonetheless find a way to arrive at and persuade a tribunal to arrive at your predisposition. When you're on a tribunal, you're independent and impartial, and in a sense, there's always the challenge of getting it right, but it's a different kind of challenge, and I never really thought about it being challenging. I guess there can be cases where the issues are difficult. I think of one case in particular where there was a dispute about share ownership, and which of two parties would end up owning a particular company. And at the outset of the I was the presiding arbitrator. At the outset of the arbitration, the parties had very different views about it. Over the course of the arbitration, despite lots of disagreements about most everything, the parties actually, following some partial awards by the tribunal that cleared away some underbrush, the parties actually came to a pretty similar position. I guess in that I've always thought about that as a case in arbitration that worked really well, because the parties, despite very significant differences, actually ended up in a place that I think both were happy with, or at least equally unhappy with. And for me, that was an example of the process working very well. I guess in that sense, it was a challenging but also rewarding case.
Thank you. We've got some more questions as well. We have a question from Marion Lee, no relation to me, I hasten to add. Presumably, you must have encountered some setbacks in your career. How did you overcome them? Or did you have a perfect career and there were no setbacks and it was just a normal Tuesday for you?
Every day has its setbacks. And I think it's a really, really good question in all ways, not many ways, in all ways, because we really do have to deal with setbacks in arbitration, like litigation. There's almost always one winner and therefore one loser. The case that I described a few moments ago, where both parties ended up being more or less happy, still involved some losers along the way, some setbacks for one side or the other, and it's extraordinarily important to be able to deal with that. And I'm not sure that I have any particularly good recipe for doing that. I think it's always important to recognize that one side's got to lose in an arbitration, and on every issue, one side more or less has to lose. You can try to redefine victory. We mitigated the damages, and you can redefine expectations, and in some cases, obviously, tribunals do what's colloquially called splitting the baby, whether they do it because that's what the law actually prescribes in a particular circumstance, or because they're compromise-minded decision makers is another question, and perhaps in those cases there's no real winner or loser. But in the huge majority of cases, somebody wins and somebody loses, and therefore somebody feels like they've suffered a setback. And I think keeping that in mind, somebody's got to lose in almost every case, and that although advocacy is hugely important, it's not your fault if your party loses. The facts may be bad, the law may be bad, and being able to get up off the ground and after a setback and go on as if you'd actually won is hugely important. It's like, I sort of think back to the last time I did a cross-examination and asked the famous one question too many, and the witness gave me exactly the answer I didn't want didn't want to hear, and you have to just pretend as if it was precisely the answer you did want to hear and move on to the next line of questions.
Knowing when to stop in cross-examination is definitely a bit of an art, I think.
Exactly.
All right, we've got some more questions coming in. Do you think a lawyer, an arbitration lawyer, I'm assuming, should invest time in learning foreign languages?
I think it depends on what language you're starting from. If you start from, I don't know, no offense to anybody, but Finnish. Yeah, I think you ought to learn some foreign languages. As they say, the most widely spoken language in the world is bad English. So if you don't speak English, I'd say learn English. If you do speak English, I think the need to learn a foreign language is less pressing. That said, international arbitration is truly international, and although bad English is widely spoken, bad Spanish, bad Portuguese, bad Arabic, bad Mandarin, bad French are also very widely spoken. And I think depending on your practice area, it may well make sense to learn one of those languages. I do think it depends on both your practice area and I guess more specifically your envisaged area of specialization. If in a sense this is, I think, obvious, but if you're going to specialize in investment arbitration in Latin America, you ought to know Spanish and perhaps Portuguese. If you're going to focus on the Middle East, then you ought to be thinking about Arabic or other regional languages. I do think there's a risk of devoting too much time to learning lots of languages. I think learning lots of substance is hugely important. And if you've got one or two of the most important languages, by that I mean the most widely spoken languages in international trade and investment, it probably makes more sense to focus on substance.
Thank you. We're getting a few questions about your Rainbow Warrior case. Was it an institutional arbitration? Was it ad hoc? What was it? Can you tell us more about it?
Well, I can't tell you a whole lot because part of the reason that France wanted to arbitrate the dispute was precisely to make sure the details of it stayed confidential. I haven't breached those confidential obligations thus far, and I can also happily report that the award, which the outcome of which was public, ended up with Greenpeace getting more than $6 million for what at the time was a 35-year-old North Sea trawler with a market value of 25,000 pounds or so. Back in the day, $6 million was a whole lot of money, and Greenpeace went off and built itself an excellent Rainbow Warrior 2, which returned to the open seas crusading that its predecessor had done. But more details are difficult. What I can say is it was ad hoc. It was seated in Switzerland. It was a 3-person tribunal with both common law and civil law arbitrators on it. It proceeded efficiently and smoothly and reached a well-reasoned result.
You can't say fairer than that, really, can you?
I'm not allowed to.
No, thank you. All right, we've got some more questions coming in. Do you think it's possible for a person to start his or her international arbitration practice in their late 50s?
I absolutely do. I think she or he could well start both international arbitration or other things in their late 50s or any other time in their life. I think I'm trying to think of examples. I certainly know litigators who have moved into sitting as arbitrator, notwithstanding being in their late 50s or older, and done very well subsequently. I think a lot depends on the individual. They have to have a yearning for confrontation if they want to become counsel in international arbitration at the age of 50 or any other age. But if she does, then there's no reason that being in her late 50s would be an issue, at least in my view.
Thank you. Aria Dixie asks, what inspired you to write your first international commercial arbitration book?
So it was a mistake. That's what inspired me. I'd written a book on international litigation in U.S. courts, and thought, oh, it will be very easy to write a case book on international arbitration. I'll just take some of the cases that are in my international litigation book and put some introductory stuff in between those cases and write some notes and comments, questions after the cases. It'll take me 6 months and I'll be done. That was a mistake. It took me a couple of years. I made an even bigger mistake, though, when I decided subsequently to convert that book, a case book on international arbitration, into what became my treatise, the International Commercial Arbitration, the evil 3 volumes that I'm sure has haunted the nights of many of the listeners on this. I looked at that case book and sort of the way I thought about the earlier case book on litigation, thought, oh, I'll just take out all the excerpts of cases and I'll take out the headings that say comments and questions, and I'll turn the notes and the questions into a little bit of text, and I'll replace the cases and materials that I took out with some discussion of what they said. Again, this will take me 6 months or so. This time I was really wrong. It was a big mistake. It took me 6 years to do what was the first 2 volumes of international commercial arbitration. I think the reason I wrote both those things, I guess a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to learn. The best way to learn, I think, is to teach, and the best way to teach is to write about stuff. And I thought the best way to really understand international commercial arbitration was by writing a treatise about it. And then sort of conversely, I a little bit presumptuously, I think, I didn't think there was anything really in the field that defined the field, that really brought it all together and provided it with a theoretical and analytical foundation, something cohesive to tie it all together, and I wanted to try to do that. No doubt I failed, but the question was what inspired me, not what I succeeded in.
Thank you very much. Let's see, what else have we got here? One of the strange things that we have in common, Gary, I remember from a few years ago when we talked about it, is we both read very fast. So I'm being asked, any tips to read long judgment faster and with better comprehension?
Oh dear. Just read the headnote. So, in some ways, long judgments, especially of some courts, I'm not going to embarrass any particular nation's courts, but especially some countries' courts, have a whole bunch of sort of factual and procedural stuff in the beginning. The same can obviously be said of arbitral awards. We've sort of defaulted into lengthy recitations of procedural history. No doubt out of concerns regarding annulment and recognition. That's, I think, a different topic for a different webinar. But I think in both cases, what's really important is the tribunal's analysis, or when the court really provides the answer, in a sense. And so I think in terms of shortcuts, and these are often only temporary shortcuts, skipping to tribunal analysis and not spending that much, or court analysis, and not spending that much time on the credits or introduction if you're used to television series is probably the most sensible way forward. Importantly, though, I did say that this was a temporary shortcut, because sometimes what's in those preliminary bits puts what the ultimate holding and the analysis leading up to that in a very different light.
Thank you. Lots of excellent questions coming in. I'm triaging them and trying to decide which to ask. What are your thoughts on the future of international arbitration? That's a really big question.
That's a very big question. We could have a separate webinar on it. We could ask, is winter coming? Or we could ask, is summer coming? And it would take a long time to answer that. I have famously, or perhaps more accurately, infamously, warned that winter may be coming to international arbitration. I've done that with an eye towards the horrendous European Court of Justice decisions in cases like ACMEA and the like, and concerns that similar types of mistrust of international arbitration may spread from investment arbitration to commercial arbitration. I've always said that, however, I view the world as a glass half full, not half empty, and that in fact, in my view, international arbitration's glass, even looking forward through the looking glass, so to speak, isn't just half, but 3/4 or more full. I have to say, I've been a little troubled by the fall off in the caseloads at the ICC, Singapore International Arbitration Center, and elsewhere in the last year. I suspect that is due to temporary events, in particular the results of the pandemic, which, although not sufficient to stop existing arbitrations from going forward with virtual hearings, I think did have an impact on how businesses chose to pursue claims and disputes. I think I'll be watching with interest and closely what happens to caseloads in the remainder of this year. I've heard that at leading institutions the figures have rebounded quite robustly, and certainly those kinds of things, annual caseloads bounce around a whole lot over time. You can't draw too many conclusions from 1 year's numbers. But I think in general, the threats to cross-border trade and investment from both the political left and the political right, efforts to reassert perceived national interest, national sovereignty, and to limit the impact of international obligations is something reflected in both ACME and other things that is of concern. And I can see why one should continue to ask the question, is winter coming? Hopefully not, but the jury is still out, so to speak.
What skill do you value the most in a young arbitration practitioner or arbitrator?
So I think those are somewhat different questions. For a young arbitration practitioner, that means somebody that would be working primarily as counsel at big law firms, say Wilmer. What I value is hard work, objective analysis, and honesty/transparency. Hard work to make sure that one has found and understood all the relevant material, whether it's law, found all the right cases, the right statutes, the right provisions of the contract, or evidence, understood the witness statements on both sides, and also turned over all the adjoining rocks where more useful information might be found. objectivity in terms of being able to then assess what it is you found, both by way of law and fact, and honesty in terms of what the strengths of your analysis are, and also what the holes in your analysis are. We don't know this, we don't know that. The following could be the case, but from a younger lawyer, but not just, frankly, not just a younger lawyer, also a colleague or somebody more senior, those attributes as well. Hard work, preparation, and objectivity, being able to look at something objectively and to present a transparent, neutral view of it, so that as a team one can try and react to that, I think is hugely important. I said that was different for an arbitration practitioner as compared to an arbitrator, and maybe I misspoke, although it still feels different to me. I think for an arbitrator, they're quite similar talents, virtues, attributes. From my perspective, what's really important is diligence, that they're prepared. I'm appalled when I get a question that reflects somebody not having read the party's submissions, because the question's been answered several times, and if one wants to ask a question on that topic in the written submissions in different ways, and if one wants to ask a question on that, it really has to base the question on what's already been said. But preparation is hugely important. It's a bit like the diligence that I mentioned. Open-mindedness is also hugely important. I think going back to thinking fast and thinking slow. First impressions are really important, but part of the reason that we have hearings, oral hearings, often in-person hearings, part of the reason that we require reasoned awards is exactly to make people question their first instincts and to think through what the issues are, and that means being willing to listen. And I've had some good tribunals, including some tribunals recently, who have quite self-evidently started off in one place, but by the end of the hearing, by the end of the arbitration, they've ended up in a very different place. And for me, at least, that's hugely important for an arbitrator, a hugely important attribute to have.
Let's have a couple of book-related questions, shall we, for a bit of variety. Do you have a writing routine?
So I sort of do. I mean, it's a little ridiculous for me as a first-time novelist to have a routine. I'm still learning, I think. And so my routines, if they were even routines to start with, might well change. But what I've done is start out with an idea, a big picture story of the plot, a storyline, a little bit like the elevator pitch that I gave in response to your question 20 minutes ago or so. Then I create a list of characters. I give them names, ages, genders, attributes, and then I write down chapter by chapter how the entire storyline, the elevator pitch that I gave you a bit ago, will progress. And so chapter 1, chapter 2, all the way to, I think in the file, chapter 80 or so. And for each chapter, I write down who the main characters in the chapter are and what happens in the chapter, where it occurs, and what happens, basically. It's very short. They're just bullet points, but I map out the entire book, and then I think about the plot. I sort of go through it several times, and only when all that's done, and in that process, going through it, inevitably the chapter headings and the order of the chapters, and which characters in which chapter morphs, it changes, evolves over time, and only when that's all done and I have some idea of where everything is going and sort of what happened before and what's happening next, do I then start trying to write write chapters. The file got written mostly on long airplane trips. I didn't much know how to use time on those long flights to Singapore or San Francisco or what have you. And so I just began in longhand in student tablets writing the file. That was my routine. I know some authors get up and first thing in the morning, perhaps after they've had their tea or coffee, begin to write. I don't set aside time like that, but I did set aside time on long airplane trips to write.
Thank you. This is a fun question. I like this question. So we'll see if you like this question too.
Okay.
Have you thought about the music that could accompany certain scenes from your book?
So I'm not very musical. I got kicked out of piano class when I was 5 years old. The teacher said I had no talent, no promise, and he didn't want to waste his time with me. So I think I'm not very well qualified to think about what the music would be. I do know my publisher is interested in making this into a movie. And so somebody is going to have to answer that question. I just don't think I'm the right person.
Well, it's good to know there are vacancies out there, even if they're not in international arbitration.
Exactly.
If you had your time again, is there a practice area of international arbitration or a sector that you wish you'd gotten into earlier?
Nobody's going to like this answer. Yeah, I really wish I'd focused on construction arbitration for most of my career.
That's possibly not the most dramatic answer. Maybe not what people were expecting at all. I really wanted to be a construction arbitration lawyer.
Conceivable that it was tongue-in-cheek.
Very good. Any recommendations for an arbitration internship in Switzerland?
Oh my goodness. So there are a number of excellent Swiss law firms, and it would be impossible for me to choose between them. Whether it's Laviv or Lenzenstalen or Schoenberg Whitmer or any of the other extraordinarily able firms in Switzerland. I think many of them have intern programs, and I would urge people to look closely at those. We've
got a music suggestion from Lorena. She says Chopin. There you go. Potential music suggestion there. Construction arbitration, come to Malaysia, says Sharifa. So there you go. You're in demand. People want you to come to Malaysia. Who in Hollywood do you think can portray the characters in your book perfectly? And I want to know this one because I've actually asked you this question before, or a subset of it.
So I'm not sure. I'm bad at that sort of thing. I could imagine Jennifer Lawrence as Sarah. I'm not sure about Jeb. I think Franklin Carrington, the bad deputy CI director, George Clooney could definitely do that. I think.
There we go. A few suggestions from Hollywood for everybody. I'm conscious, Gary, that you have a very busy lifestyle and you probably also have to feed your cats. So I don't want to keep you on the line indefinitely. I'm pretty sure we'd be getting questions. We could just keep getting questions for the next 3 hours if we waited. But I'm conscious that I'm sure you have other things that you need to do. So I don't want to.
Very sweet of you, and thank you so much for having had the opportunity to talk about the file and about arbitration. They're both my loves, so giving me a chance to talk about that to people who are also interested in it is wonderful. And again, happy birthday. I hope this was a good way to celebrate.
I have one last very important question. Where can people buy a copy of the file?
That is a critically important question. And these days, I think you can buy most things on Amazon. And if you do buy a copy, and if you're as enthusiastic about it as I am, please read a review. The only way an aspiring first-time novelist, that's me, ever avoids sinking without a trace beneath the surface of the publishing world, as if if Amazon's algorithms rate you highly, which in turn requires reviews. So if you buy it and if you like it, please do a review. And thank you again, Andy, for the kind invitation and the great questions.
My pleasure. It also gives you, everybody listening, a great opportunity to write to Gary and tell him exactly what you thought of his book. So there you go. If you're, one of the questions was, how do you network with senior arbitration practitioners? There you go. There is a good excuse. Well, thank you once again to everyone who's joined us today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. I hope we gave you something a little bit different as well, some things that we might not normally discuss on an arbitration webinar. We hope to make a recording available in due course. And in the meantime, please let us know who you'd like to see us in conversation with in the future, and we'll see what we can do. We do have a competition, of course, and we will be writing to the successful competition winner by email because I don't want to be announcing people's personal details on the internet. So a little bit of caution there. So thank you to everybody for their interesting questions. We're getting lots of thank you very muches. And we're very grateful for that feedback. So thank you all. Have a good rest of the day. Enjoy your weekend. And thank you, of course, to Gary for helping us celebrate our birthday.
Thank you again.
Thank you.